They slept safely that night, warm inside their stone walls, fires burning in every hearth, the smell of roasted meat still drifting through the corridors of the Frostclaw stronghold. Children curled against their mothers. Warriors laughed too loudly over mead they hadn't earned, and Alpha Vardos, the man who had once pressed his forehead to mine and whispered, "You are the only thing in this world I would burn everything for," sat in his great carved chair and felt nothing. Not one of them knew. Not one of them felt the moment the sky began to rot. But I did, because I was the one holding it together, and they had just thrown me out. My name is Sela. No family name, no rank. Not anymore. 12 minutes ago, I had both. I had a title, Warding of the Veil, though no one in that pack ever understood what it meant. Not really. They saw a thin, pale woman who coughed too often and couldn't shift cleanly. They saw someone who moved through the pack like a draft through a cracked wall, present, persistent, and ultimately unwanted. The rain started the moment Vardos's boot connected with my chest. I want you to understand how that felt. Not the physical pain, though that was real, though I felt 2 ribs crack like dry kindling under his heel. I want you to understand the specific humiliation of lying in frozen mud, lungs collapsed against the ground, looking up at the face of a man who had kissed the scar on your collarbone and told you it was beautiful, and watching him look at you now like you are something he scraped off his boot. The crowd was cheering. That was what I couldn't prepare for. I had run through this moment in my mind 100 times. The exile, the cold, the silence. I had prepared for silence. I had not prepared for the sound of 300 voices calling my name like it was something shameful, like Sela was a curse word they were finally allowed to say out loud. Useless, sickly burden, dead weight. The sky above the Frostclaw stronghold was the color of a bruise turning septic, a deep, suffocating green-black at the edges, where the clouds pressed down low, and underneath it, the first thin tendrils of something darker, something that had no color at all, something that the pack didn't have a word for because they had never had to see it. I had kept it from their eyes for 7 years. 7 years of quiet blood. 7 years of walking the border at midnight with my palm pressed to the stone markers, whispering the old language into the cold until my voice gave out and my knees gave way, and I dragged myself home and told everyone I'd tripped. 7 years of trading pieces of my own soul, sliver by sliver, like coins dropped into a jar, to maintain the heart veil, the invisible shield woven from living magic that stood between the Frostclaw pack and the void mist that wanted to swallow every breathing thing within these walls. They were still alive because of me, and they had just exiled me into the dark. Vardos stood on the raised platform and read from a prepared text. He had prepared. He had sat down with his elders and his warriors and his perfectly selected words, and he had crafted the formal dissolution of everything I was to this pack. His voice was even, measured, the voice of a man making a calculated decision he had fully made peace with. He snapped my pack locket in 2 with one hand. The sound of it hitting the frozen mud was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I did not fold my arms. I did not reach for the pieces. I had decided, somewhere between the moment I felt the first crack in the veil this morning, a crack that told me what was coming before any word was spoken, and the moment I walked down into that courtyard, that I would not let them see me hold myself together. I kept my hands loose at my sides. I kept my eyes open, and I looked just once at the sky beyond the stronghold's walls, at the darkness beginning to spiral in the distance, patient and hungry and no longer held back, and I thought, you have no idea what I just walked away from. You have no idea what is coming for you now. And then I turned, and I walked through the gates of the only home I had ever known, and the Frostclaw pack cheered behind me like they had won something. They had not won something. They had just condemned themselves. And I was the only one in the world who could still save them. The question was whether I should. Before we go any further into Selah's story, I want to pause for just a moment and say thank you, genuinely. You chose to spend your time here in this world with this woman, and that is not something I take lightly. If you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what brought you to this channel today? Whether it's your morning commute, a late night you can't sleep through, or a heartbreak you're still processing, I want to know. It quietly means everything, and it helps more than you know. Now, let's go back to Selah. Chapter 1. The Shattered Locket. The gate closed behind me with a sound like a jaw snapping shut. I walked. I did not run. Running would have required energy I had already spent. 3 weeks' worth of deep reserve magic poured into the veil just this past month alone, because the mist had been pressing harder lately, hungrier, like it could sense something shifting, like it knew. It knew. I understood that now. It had felt me weakening, not from illness, though the pack had decided illness was the most convenient explanation for the way my hands trembled during the harvest feast, and the way I'd fainted twice in the training yard, and the way my hair had been going silver at the roots since I was 19. No, it was weakening because 7 years of feeding a magical barrier with your own life force is not a sustainable exchange rate. The veil had been taking more than I could regenerate. The interest on the debt had been compounding for years. And tonight, with the pack locket broken and my bond to the Frostclaw territory severed by formal exile, the veil had lost its anchor. I felt it the moment the gates closed. A low, resonant snap somewhere behind my sternum, like a rope pulled to its absolute limit finally giving way. It didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt more like pressure releasing, like something I had been bracing against for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. And then the cold came. Not the rain. The rain had been falling since Vardos lifted his boot from my chest, as if the sky had waited for that specific signal. This was something deeper than weather. This was the cold of the void mist, the sourceless chill that came not from wind or altitude, but from absence, from the particular temperature of a place where living things are slowly being unmade. I turned my face into it. My hair was soaked and dark against my neck. My armor, the practical, beaten leather of someone who had spent 7 years walking borders in the dark rather than sitting in feasting halls, was heavy with rain and cold and the particular weight of a chapter ending. I pressed my hand to the outside of the gate wall as I passed it, just for a moment. The stone was rough and familiar, and I had touched it 1,000 times on 1,000 midnights when no one was watching. Goodbye, I told it. Not in words, in the old language, the one that runs underneath language, through the blood and the bone, and the small electric hum of a soul that is still, barely, intact. The stone didn't answer. It never did. That was fine. I had learned a long time ago not to need things to answer. The road out of Frostclaw territory wound through a corridor of black-trunked trees, and I walked it the way I had always walked difficult things, 1 foot in front of the other, eyes forward, saving my breath. The torches of the settlement were still visible behind me, warm and gold through the rain, and I didn't let myself look at them. I almost made it. I was 40 paces past the gate, 43, 47. And then I heard it, a sound from somewhere inside the walls behind me, a low, confused murmur that rippled through the crowd noise, distinct from the celebration, distinct from the cheering, a question passing through 300 people at once, the sound of people noticing something wrong without yet knowing what it is. And underneath it, just barely, the first thin wail of the mist finding the gap where the veil had been. My steps slowed. Stopped. I stood in the rain at the edge of Frostclaw territory, with the road ahead of me dark and the settlement behind me beginning, in its own quiet way, to die. And I asked myself the question I had been asking myself for 7 years. How much is enough? How much do you give to people who never once asked your name for the right reasons? How much of yourself do you spend on a pack that spent tonight cheering for your removal? The mist curled around my ankles like something patient, like something that had been waiting for me to be free of obligations before it introduced itself properly. Ahead of me, in the tree line, something moved that wasn't wind. I felt eyes before I saw them, steady, amber dark, watching from the shadows with the particular intensity of someone who has been watching for a long time and has simply been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending they haven't. A man stepped out of the dark, tall, pack-scarred in the way of someone who has survived things that should have ended them, eyes the deep gold of a wolf who had mastered something beyond the basic shift, something earned at great cost. He wore no insignia, no rank marks, just the quiet authority of someone who has never needed them. He looked at me the way no one inside those walls had ever looked at me. Not at what I provided, not at what I cost, not at whether I was strong enough or healthy enough or useful enough. He looked at me. Sella, he said, my name in his mouth like he'd been carrying it for years. I said nothing. I know what you just lost, he said, and I know what they just lost, even if they don't yet. He tilted his head toward the sound building behind the walls, the murmur deepening now into something closer to panic, the first flicker of torch fire going strange colors as the Herod border tested the border scenes. You've been holding them together since the cataclysm, every single day. My chest was so tight I couldn't tell if it was the cracked ribs or something else entirely. Who are you? My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Fenric, he said, Alpha of the Lost Pack. A pause. Recall that because the other packs don't believe we exist. Something moved in his expression, dark and careful and almost wry. We keep it that way on purpose. The mist pressed harder at the border behind me. I heard something that might have been screaming, might have been wind, might have been both. They're going to need you, Fenric said, and you're going to have to decide what that means to you. He didn't tell me to save them. He didn't tell me to let them burn. He stood in the rain at the edge of the world, and he offered me something no one in the Frostclaw pack had thought to offer me in 7 years. A choice. My choice. I turned and looked back at the gate, at the flickering torches, at the green-black stain spreading at the sky's edges where the heart veil was unraveling like a cut thread. I thought of Vardos, of his voice reading the prepared text, of my locket in the mud. I thought of 300 people who had never once asked what I did at midnight. I thought of every cracked rib I had never reported, every night of cold, every piece of soul I had fed into the dark to keep them breathing. And I thought, you cannot pour from an empty cup, but I am not empty yet. I pressed my palm flat against the stone wall one last time, and I began to decide. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. I walked for an hour before my legs gave out. Not from exhaustion, or not only from that. My body had been running on the particular fuel of adrenaline and pride, the kind that keeps you upright through the worst of it and then drops you the moment no one is watching. I went down on one knee in the mud at the edge of the gray wood, one hand catching the root of an old birch, and I stayed there, in the rain, and I let myself feel it. All of it. because I had not cried in the courtyard. I had promised myself that, and I had kept it. But there is a cost to that kind of discipline. The grief doesn't disappear, it just waits. It is patient in a way that living things rarely are. It holds everything you refuse to show them, and it finds you later, alone in the dark, and it makes you pay the full amount with interest. 7 years. That was the number that kept arriving in my chest like something thrown hard. 7 years I had kept their secret, not even their secret, mine. The thing I had done for them that they never asked for and never knew about and would never, even now, fully understand. I was 17 when the mist came. I need you to understand what it looked like. Most people, when they hear void mist, they picture fog. They picture something gray and damp and inconvenient. That is not what it was. What came over the eastern ridge on the night of the great cataclysm was a darkness that moved with intention. It rolled down from the mountains like something that had been held back a long time and was finished being patient. It had a sound, low, below hearing, more vibration than noise, the kind of frequency you feel in your back teeth and behind your eyes. It smelled like cold iron and old grief. And it ate people. Not their bodies. Their bodies stayed. That was the part no one talks about because there are no words clean enough for it. The mist took the living part out of you, whatever animates a body beyond the mechanical, beyond the beating of blood and the firing of nerves, and left the rest standing, still breathing, still moving, but gone, hollow as a struck bell that has finished ringing. It took 47 Frostclaw wolves in the first night. I watched them walk into the mess hall the next morning with their eyes flat and their faces slack, and I knew. I was 17, and I knew in the way that children who have grown up adjacent to old magic always know, before the words arrive, in the body, in the gut. The pack didn't know what they were looking at. They called it shock, battle trauma. They gave the hollow ones warm food and placed them in their beds and told each other it would pass. It would not pass. I went to the forest that night. I don't know how to explain what the forest was, not in terms that would mean anything to someone who hadn't been taught to listen to it. My mother had taught me before she disappeared, before I was brought to Frostclaw as a stranger child with no name and no history and one very specific, very dangerous inheritance. She had pressed my small hands to the bark of trees and told me, everything alive has a voice if you are willing to go quiet enough to hear it. The Greywood heard me coming. I walked into the dark between the old trees with rain soaking through my clothes and terror sitting in my stomach like a stone, and I said out loud to no one I could see, I need to know how to stop it. The answer came the way the forest always answered, not in words, in feeling, in understanding that arrived fully formed like something I had always known being unlocked. There was a way. There was always a way. That is the thing about old magic that no one warns you about before you go looking for it. It is never without an answer. It is only ever without a mercy. The heart veil, a barrier woven not from physical material, but from living intention, from a soul willing to stand as anchor between the pack and the dark. It would hold the mist back. It would keep the hollow ones tethered to their bodies, their consciousness slowly pulled back like a tide returning. It would preserve the Frostclaw pack entire, every man, woman, and child within the border, so completely that in the morning they would wake and remember nothing, and feel nothing but the vague sense that something terrible had almost happened. The cost was simple. Me. Not all at once. The forest was not cruel enough for that. No, it would take me slowly, a piece at a time, a sliver of soul per day, called up through my blood and fed into the ground and carried through the root system to every marker stone at every border post. I would age in ways that had nothing to do with years. I would weaken. My wolf would suffer. My body would begin to fail by degrees so gradual that anyone watching would simply assume I was sickly by nature. And I could never tell anyone. The veil required silence the way a fire requires oxygen. The moment the knowledge became communal, The anchor would shift from individual sacrifice to collective awareness, and collective awareness would invite collective doubt, and doubt would crack it open from the inside. I pressed my palm to the root of the oldest tree in the graywood, and I opened my hand and I let the thorn from its bark drive into the center of my lifeline. The blood came. The forest took it. And somewhere inside the frostclaw walls, 47 hollow wolves took a breath that was real for the first time in 24 hours. I was 17 years old. I was alone in the dark, and I had just signed a contract with Forever. What I did not know, could not have known, standing there bleeding into the roots with my teenage heart full of something I mistook for bravery, was that the forest had taken more than my blood that night. It had taken the record, and somewhere in the graywood, in the language written in root and ring and the growth of things that outlive human memory, my name was now part of the Frostclaw Pack's foundation in a way that no exile decree, no broken locket, no Alpha's boot could ever fully undo. Vardos had exiled a woman. He had not exiled what held his people to the earth, and the mist, patient as it was, had been counting on exactly that confusion. Chapter 3. The First Crack. I had been walking for 2 hours when I felt the first one die. Not a person, not yet. Something smaller, one of the border anchor points I had fed every week for 7 years, a flat gray stone half buried at the northeast marker, the one closest to the ridge where the mist had first come down. I felt it go out the way you feel a candle extinguish in a room you are standing in. Not sight, not sound, just a sudden awareness of less warmth than there was a moment ago. I stopped walking, pressed my hand to my sternum, counted. There were 14 anchor stones ringing the Frostclaw border. I had placed each one myself over the first 3 months after the blood pact, walking the perimeter alone at midnight with a small iron tool and bleeding into each one until it held. 14 stones. 14 points of contact between my soul and the ground they stood on. And now, 2 hours after the exile, the first one had gone cold. 13 left. I kept walking. This is the thing about grief that no one tells you. It doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like math, like standing in a burning building and calculating how long you have before the floor gives way. The feelings are there, underneath, but the mind puts them behind glass because the mind understands that falling apart right now will not help anything. And so, you count, you calculate, you put one foot in front of the other, and you let the numbers be the thing that keeps you moving when nothing else will. 13 anchor stones, 13 points still holding. For now. His name was Kale. He was 22 years old, and he was Vardos's younger brother by 6 years, and he had the same wide-set jaw and the same storm-colored eyes, and absolutely none of the same coldness. Where Vardos had learned early to perform certainty, Kale had never quite managed it. He was the kind of person who noticed things, small things, wrong things, the particular quality of silence that means something is off before anyone has identified what. I had always liked him for that. I had never told him. He was the first one to see it. He had been in the Eastern Garden when the exile crowd dispersed, sitting on the low stone wall the way he did when he needed to think, turning a piece of broken tile over in his hands. The Eastern Garden was full of the flowers I had planted 3 years ago, not for beauty, though they were beautiful, but because certain root systems conduct soul energy better than stone, and the garden sat almost directly above 2 of the anchor lines. I had told everyone I planted them because the pack needed color. Vardos had called it a waste of good growing space and said nothing else, and I had smiled and said nothing back. The flowers were called Greyheart. They bloomed silver white in the dark, and they had been blooming without interruption for 3 years. Kale was sitting beside them when they started to die. Not slowly, that was what caught him. Flowers don't wilt the way these did, all at once, as if some signal had passed through the bed that only they could receive. One moment they were standing, the next they were bowed, heads dropping, color draining out of the petals in a gradient from the outer edge inward, silver going to gray, going to the particular brown of something that has lost whatever it was that made it living. He stood up. He looked at the flowers for a long time, and then he looked at the sky. Back inside the great hall, no one had noticed yet. The celebration from the courtyard had moved indoors. Someone had brought out the good mead, someone else had started a fire too large for the hearth, and no one had stopped them, and the specific noise of people who believe they have resolved something was filling every corner of the space. Vardos was at the head table. He was not celebrating, exactly. That was not his way. He was simply present in the way of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the feeling that he was right to arrive. It hadn't arrived yet. He assumed it would. He was looking at his hands when Kale came in. "Brother." Vardos looked up, read Kale's face, looks back down. "Whatever it is, it can wait. The Greyheart Garden is dead." A pause. "Flowers die. All of them, at once, 5 minutes ago," Kale said, both hands on the table. "And the sun looks wrong." "The sun? Come outside and look at it." He didn't want to. I know Vardos well enough to know that. He didn't want to go outside because going outside meant looking at something that might require him to feel something he had already decided not to feel. He had exiled me. He had resolved it. The chapter was closed. But he went. They stood together in the eastern courtyard, and Vardos looked up at the sky. The sun was still there, still in its position, but the light it was throwing was wrong. Muted, flat, the way light looks through old glass. Shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. Colors that were slightly less than they had been an hour ago, as if someone had taken the world and turned the brightness down by a single degree. Just enough to notice, not enough to name. Kale said, quietly, "Where is Sella?" And the word that came from Vardos, not an answer, just a breath, just the reflex of a man who has just heard a question that he does not want to follow to its conclusion, was silence. The worst kind. The kind that means he already knows he made a mistake and is not yet ready to say it out loud. And underneath that silence, at the northeast border, the second anchor stone went cold. Chapter 4. The Shadow in the Woods. The third anchor stone went cold at midnight. I felt it like a tooth being pulled, that specific interior wrench of something that was part of you simply ceasing to be. I was deep in the graywood by then, moving by feel more than sight because the clouds had eaten the moon, and the trees here grew so close together that even on a clear night, the dark between them was total. My ribs screamed with every step. I had bound them with a strip torn from the inner lining of my cloak, tight enough to keep the broken ends from shifting, loose enough to breathe. It wasn't enough. It was what I had. 11 stones left. I counted them the way some people count prayers. I had not eaten since morning. I had not slept since the night before last, because 2 nights ago I had felt the mist pressing at the northern border with a persistence that meant something was coming, and I had spent 6 hours reinforcing the anchor lines instead of sleeping, and then the morning had brought the exile and the boot in my chest and the long walk into the dark. My body was making its feelings about all of this very clear. I stopped at a narrow creek, knelt, drank with my hands. The water was ice cold and tasted like minerals and old leaves, and I was so thirsty I didn't care. I stayed crouched there for a moment longer than I needed to, letting the cold of it pull some of the fever heat out of my palms. Because that was new, the fever. It had started an hour ago, a deep internal warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the fact that the veil was unraveling and the energy it sent back through our connection as it died was not clean energy. It was the magical equivalent of a wound going septic. I needed to keep moving. I stood, and the forest went silent. You learn, after enough midnights in places like this, to read the quality of silence. There is the silence of late-night stillness, which is full of small sounds if you listen. Insects, water, the creak of branches settling. There is the silence of a predator moving through, which empties a space of everything beneath it on the food chain. And there is the silence of the mist creatures, which empties a space of everything. Full stop. No insects, no water sound, no wind. The creek beside me stopped making noise as if someone had turned a dial. The trees stopped moving, and the temperature dropped, not gradually, not the way night cold accumulates, but all at once, like stepping from a warmy room into a freezer. My breath came out in a plume and kept coming, the air so cold now that each exhale crystallized before it dispersed. I had met mist creatures before, 3 times in 7 years. Always at the border, always when the veil had thinned enough to let one through. Always alone because there was no one to come with me and nothing to explain why I needed to be there. They were not animals, not in any way that word means something. They were what happened when the mist found a shape that worked. Long-limbed, low to the ground, moving in the specific way of things that don't quite understand how joints are supposed to work. They made no sound of their own. They borrowed the sounds of their last meal. I heard my name in a voice I recognized, my mother's voice, coming from the dark between the trees to my left. That was how they hunted. I knew this. I had known this for 7 years, and it still went through me like a blade because the voice was exact. Not an approximation, not a near match, but the specific warmth of her. The way she said my name like it was something she was glad to say, like it cost her nothing and gave her something. I had not heard my mother's voice since I was 8 years old. My hands were shaking, not from cold, from the specific cruelty of it, the way the worst things always find the exact right wound. I pressed my back against the birch behind me, and I reached inside myself for the soul energy that remained, and I started pulling it up from whatever reserve still existed, coaxing it toward my palms the way you coax a fire from damp wood. Carefully, with full attention, aware that you only have so many attempts before the material gives up. The light came, weak, silver pale and guttering, but it came. 3 of them broke from the tree line. What followed was not a fight in any sense that word dignifies. It was survival in its most basic form. Me against the dark. One small light against 3 things that had no fear of it, only a temporary aversion. I burned the first with a full palm strike that cost me more than I had to spend. I drove the second back with a sustained push that left my vision blackening at the edges. The third got close enough that I felt its cold on my face, on my neck, fingers of chill reaching for the specific warmth at my center that it wanted to consume. And then, something hit it from the side with a force that cracked 2 of the trees nearest to us. The creature dispersed. Not died. Creatures like that don't die, they just lose cohesion, become mist again, retreat until they can reform somewhere else. But it was gone. They all were. And the sound came back into the forest. The creek, the insects, the relieved exhale of a space returning to itself. I was on my knees. I didn't remember going down. Fenric stepped into what little light remained. He was breathing hard, not heavily the way fighters breathe at the real effort, the careful control of someone managing adrenaline. He looked at me the way I imagined field medics look at the wounded, fast, assessing, cataloging damage without flinching from it. 3 of them, he said, not a question. I noticed. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to. He crouched in front of me, eye level, close enough that I could see the amber dark of his eyes in the dark, a wolf's eyes, gold lit from somewhere inside them. Up close, he was older than I'd first registered, not in years, in experience, the particular age of someone who has survived things that should have ended them and carries the weight of each one consciously. You're running a soul fever, he said. I know. You've been feeding the veil alone for 7 years. I looked at him. How long have you known? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something I hadn't expected. Not pity, something rawer than that. something that sounded, if I was being honest, in the way that hurt, like anger on my behalf. "I first saw your glow 6 years and 4 months ago," he said. "Northeast border, winter. You were reinforcing the anchor stones alone at 2 in the morning in a snowstorm, and the light you were putting out was visible from the ridge." A pause. "I thought you were a border spirit. It took me 3 weeks to understand you were a person." 6 years. He had been watching for 6 years. "You never came forward. You weren't free. Simple, certain, like a law of physics. You had a bond to that territory. If I had approached you then, you would have told Vardos, and whatever slim chance you had at a life inside those walls would have ended." I stared at him. "So you waited." "I waited," he said, "for those fools to be stupid enough to let you go." And something in my chest, something that had been locked and braced and deliberately, painfully closed for 7 years, cracked open so suddenly that I had to look away from him because I would not let him see what that sentence did to me. Someone had been watching, not to use me, not to measure what I could provide, not to calculate my value against my cost, just watching, waiting, believing with a patience that shamed everything I thought I understood about patience, that I was worth waiting for. I looked back at the Frostclaw direction. The sky above the tree line was the wrong color now, a deep, pulsing green-black that had nothing to do with clouds. The 4th anchor stone had just gone cold. I felt it like a molar being extracted. 10 left. "They're running out of time," I said. "Yes," Fenric said, "and so am I." He didn't argue with that. He just held my gaze with those amber dark eyes and waited, again, still, endlessly patient, for me to decide what I was going to do next. And somewhere behind me, deep in the graywood, something ancient stirred in the roots. The forest, it seemed, had an opinion. Chapter 5. The Final Breath. Fenric built a small fire. He did it without asking, without ceremony. Just moved to the nearest dry side of a fallen oak, found what he needed, and had flame going inside 3 minutes. Practical, efficient. The way people move when they have learned that warmth is not a luxury, it's a decision you make before the cold makes it for you. He didn't tell me to come closer. He just built it and stepped back and let me choose. I chose closer. We sat on opposite sides of it, not speaking, and I held my hands toward the heat and watched the soul fever light move under my skin like something trying to get out. It had reached my forearms now. Under the surface, the faintest luminescence, silver pale, the color of the gray heart flowers before they died, pulsing with a rhythm that was not quite my heartbeat, the veil's heartbeat, what remained of it. 9 stones left. Then 8 while I was watching the fire. "You're counting them," Fenric said. Not a question. I always count them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does it hurt?" I thought about lying, the old reflex, the one I had built over 7 years of telling people I was fine, I just hadn't slept well, I was just cold. The wolf thing was just a quirk of my particular bloodline. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to see here. Go back inside where it's warm. "Yes," I said. Just that. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they are receiving something that matters and they don't want to break it with too many words. We sat with that for a while. The screaming started at the 7th stone. Not screaming I heard with my ears, nothing that clean. It came through the bond, through the root lines, through the 7-year-old connection between my blood and Frostclaw ground. 300 souls in various states of terror, and I felt all of them at once, a wall of human panic hitting me so hard I bent forward over my knees and pressed both fists against the earth just to have something solid to push against. Fenric was beside me before I finished the motion, one hand on my back, not pulling, not pushing, just there, present in the way of someone who understands that sometimes the only thing you can offer a person is your physical reality next to theirs. "How many?" he said. "7 gone." I forced my breathing even. It's moving faster now. Once the veil thins past a certain point, the mist doesn't seep, it floods. I could feel them, specifically, individually, in the way the bond had always worked. Not thoughts, not words, but the emotional signatures of people I had spent 7 years tethered to. The particular panic signature of children who don't understand what's wrong, only that the adults are afraid. Warriors trying to fight something that teeth and claws don't touch. And underneath all of it, the hollow ones, the 47 I had pulled back from the mist's claim 7 years ago, beginning, slowly, terribly, to go quiet again. Going hollow a second time. I felt the 6th stone go. And then I felt something I had not anticipated. I felt Vardos. His signature was distinct. I would have known it if I'd been blind and deaf and 1,000 miles further. 7 years of proximity does that. 7 years of loving someone who doesn't see you burns their particular frequency into you like a brand. I felt his fear, which was new. Vardos did not do fear, or had never allowed himself to, or had never been presented with something large enough to crack the performance of certainty he had been giving since he was 16 years old. He was afraid now, and underneath the fear, something worse. Understanding. He was starting to understand. I could feel the edges of it, the way his mind was moving toward the shape of what he had done, reaching for it the way you reach for a sore tooth, not wanting to touch it, unable to stop. I hated that I could still feel him. I hated that even now, with my ribs cracked and my soul bleeding out and the fever turning my blood to something that wasn't quite blood anymore, the specific weight of his fear moved through me differently than everyone else's. Not more important, just different. The particular difference of a wound you received from someone you loved versus a wound from a stranger. Same damage, different echo. I pulled my attention back because I had a decision to make, and I could not make it while feeling him. The great anchor was not something the forest had explained to me as a possibility. It had existed at the edge of the blood pack's terms the way an emergency exit exists in a building. Present, accessible, never the option you want to use. It would work, it would hold, it would seal the Frostclaw border permanently, anchor all 14 stones simultaneously with a single catastrophic expenditure of everything I had left, and give the pack a veil that would hold without a living body feeding it. The cost was the living body. My living body. Not death. The forest had been specific about that, in the way it was specific about things, in feeling rather than words. Not death, but severance. The cord between my soul and my wolf. The cord between my magic and my blood. The thing that made me what I was. Cut clean. I would survive it. I would wake up ordinary. No glow, no bond, no night walks, no counting stones. Just a woman with silver hair and cracked ribs, and a future that was entirely, terrifyingly her own. I would survive it. They would survive it. And I would never be able to do it again. Fenric read my face. He was very good at that, alarmingly good for someone I had known for hours. Selah, don't. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking, I said carefully, that I am so tired of being the only one who shows up. Then don't show up. There are children in there. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. When he opened them, the amber dark was very still. I know. I need you to not talk me out of it. I'm not going to talk you out of it." His voice was low and even, and it cost him something to keep it that way. "I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm going to let you do what you've already decided." I waited. "After," he said, "will you let me be the one you wake up to?" The fifth stone went cold. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I pressed both palms flat against the earth, and I closed my eyes, and I reached down into the root lines the way I had reached down into them for 7 years, and I found every remaining thread of what I was, every sliver of soul I had left, every reserve, every piece I had been trying to protect for a future I hadn't believed in until approximately 40 minutes ago. And I pulled it all up at once. The light came out of me like a sound, silver white, violent, absolute. It went into the ground and down the roots and out to all 14 stones simultaneously, and I felt each one catch like a match, one after another, flame jumping gap to gap in a chain that moved faster than thought. The void mist hit the resealed border and screamed. I felt it retreat. I felt 300 people take a breath. And then I felt the cord, the oldest part of me, the part that had existed before Frostclaw, before the Blood Pact, before everything, going taut. The forest collecting its payment, the price arriving exactly as agreed, exactly as promised, without cruelty and without mercy, simply the completion of a contract written in blood on a cold night when I was 17 years old and had not understood what I was giving away. I felt it pull. I felt it snap. The pain was the color white. And then Fenric's arms were around me, and I was going down, and the last thing I registered before the dark took everything was the feeling of my hair against my hands. And it had been dark brown my whole life, always, even as it silvered at the roots. And now, between one breath and the next, it was white. Completely white. All the way through. Like snow. Like something that has given everything it had left to give and is finally, for the first time in 7 years, finished. Chapter 6. A Different Throne. The first thing I noticed was the ceiling. Stone, but warm-toned, the kind of amber gray that happens when rock has absorbed years of firelight. Carved in places, not decoratively, just practically, channels cut to manage condensation. The work of people who understood how to live inside something permanent rather than just inhabit it. I stared at it for a long time before I understood that I was staring at it, before I understood that I had eyes open, before I understood that I was breathing without pain for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember. My ribs. I moved carefully, took inventory. The breaks were still there. I could feel the particular tenderness of bone that has been set and bound properly, but the grinding wrongness of them was gone. Someone had done this while I was unconscious, cleaned the wounds on my palms, replaced my soaked, ruined clothes with something dry and soft, placed me in a bed that was, and I want to be precise about this because it matters, the first bed I had slept in that felt like it was made for a person, not a function, not a warden, not a shield, a person. I sat up slowly. The room was not large, but it had a window, and through it came morning light, real morning light, the clear, uncomplicated gold of a sun that was not filtered through the wrong-colored sky of a pack losing its anchor. My hands were in my lap, and I looked at them for a long time. No glow, no fever light moving under the skin, no pulse that wasn't my own. Just hands. I pressed them together, felt the pressure, felt the warmth of my own palms against each other, and absolutely nothing else. No root lines, no stone signatures, no distant emotional frequencies of 300 people I had spent 7 years carrying. The silence where the bond had been was enormous. I had expected it to feel like loss, and it did. I want to be honest about that because pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. 7 years is a long time to be tethered to something, even a thing that cost you, even a thing that was slowly consuming you from the inside out. When it goes, it leaves a shape, an absence, the exact size and weight of what it was, and you feel that shape for a long time before you stop reaching into it by reflex. But underneath the loss, something else. Something I didn't have a name for at first because I had never felt it in a form this clean. Rest. Actual rest. Not the shallow unconsciousness of exhaustion. Not the sleep of someone who is only stopping because their body refused to continue. Real rest. The kind that means somewhere, underneath everything, you are finally safe enough to go fully quiet. I was still sitting there, hands in my lap, learning what quiet felt like, when the door opened. Fenric did not enter the way men who own spaces usually enter them. He stopped at the threshold, waited, asked with his posture whether he could come in rather than assuming the answer. I nodded. He brought food, bread, something warm in a clay bowl, water that smelled clean, and he set it on the low table beside the bed, and he sat in the chair across from it. And he did not watch me eat. He looked at the window, giving me the privacy of not being observed in a moment of basic need. That small thing, that one small considered thing undid something in me that 7 years of harder circumstances had not touched. I ate. He waited. When I was done, he said quietly, "How do you feel?" I said, "Ordinary." Something in his face shifted. Not pity, recognition. Is that good or bad? I thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. Ask me again in a week. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. I can do that. Vardos arrived on the 3rd day. I knew he was coming before he reached the fortress, not through any magic, I had none left, but because Fenric told me, and because the particular dread that settled in my chest when I heard his name had its own kind of warning system. I was in the eastern yard, learning the names of the Lost Pack's wolves, practicing the ordinary social interactions that I had never quite mastered because I had always been too busy being useful to practice being present, when Fenric appeared at my shoulder. "He's at the border," he said. "Alone. Asking for you." I went still. "You don't have to see him." "I know. I will turn him away right now if you want. 1 word." I looked at Fenric's face, at the steadiness in it, the complete, unconditional willingness to do exactly what he said, to place himself between me and anything I didn't want to face, not because he thought I couldn't handle it, but because he understood that having the choice was the thing I had never been given. "No," I said. "I'll see him." Vardos looked smaller outside the context of his power. That was the thing I had not anticipated. Inside Frostclaw, surrounded by his rank and his hall and his carved chair, and 300 people who organized themselves around his authority, he seemed like a fixed point, immovable. Now he stood at the edge of a territory that was not his, without his warriors, without his prepared text, without the raised platform that had always given his words extra height, and he was just a man, wide-faced, gray-templed, eyes the color of storm water, looking at me the way people look when they have finally done the math and do not like the answer. Selah, my name, no rank, no formal address. Vardos. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment I could see him choosing between several versions of what he had come to say. The version that was, still, underneath everything, about the pack. The version that was, if I was being honest, still about him, and the version that might have been real. He chose real. Whatever else I believe about him, I will give him that. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't." The elders have found records, old ones from before my father's time, about the cataclysm, about what actually happened that night. His jaw worked. About what you did. I said nothing. They're calling you the founder now, inside the walls. His voice was careful and breakable at once. They want to build something with your name on it. Something moved through me at that. Not satisfaction, not the vindication I might have expected to feel. Something quieter and sadder than that. Because a monument is what you build for someone when you have run out of time to treat them right while they were standing in front of you. A monument is guilt in stone. My people are still fading, he said. The words cost him. The veil is holding. Whatever you did at the border, it's holding. But the people who were hollow before, who you anchored the first time, they're slipping again, slowly. We think without the living connection, I know what they'll do. He looked at me. I can't fix it, I said. Not because I won't, because I can't. What I gave at the border was everything. There is nothing left of that part of me. It's gone. I said it clean, without apology, without softening it to make it easier for him to receive. You needed a warden, and you exiled her. That debt is not one I can keep paying. His eyes went bright in a way I had never seen. Vardos did not cry, had never, in 6 years of proximity, allowed it. But his eyes went bright and his jaw was set in the way of a man holding something back through sheer force of a will that is beginning to lose the argument. I know, he said, barely audible. I know. We stood there for a moment in the particular silence of things that are finished. And then he said, quieter still, Are you happy? I looked back over my shoulder, at the fortress, at the eastern yard, at the lost pack wolves who had learned my name in 3 days and used it easily, like it was simply mine, like it had always been mine. At Fenric, standing at a respectful distance, watching not with possessiveness, but with the steady attention of a man who has decided that someone is worth paying attention to and has no intention of stopping. A man who had waited 6 years for fools to let me go, who had built a fire in the dark and sat on the other side of it and asked, without agenda, whether it hurt, who had said, Will you let me be the one you wake up to? And then held me while I came apart and carried me here, and given me a room with a warm ceiling, and food, and the radical, devastating gift of choosing whether to open the door. I turned back to Vardos. Yes, I said. And I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with him, and I think he understood that, because something in his face resolved into a grief that was clean and deserved and entirely his to carry. He left before noon. I watched him go from the eastern wall, and I did not feel what I thought I would feel. Not triumph, not grief. Something more like the moment after a long illness finally breaks, the strange, tender awareness of your own body returning to itself, the world going back to its correct colors. I pressed my hand to the stone wall beside me. Just a wall. No root lines, no soul debt, no magic moving under my palm demanding something. Just stone and my hand and the ordinary warmth of a morning that belonged entirely to me. Fenric appeared beside me, said nothing, looked out at the same tree line. After a while he said, He's gone? He's gone. A pause. And I thought about 7 years of midnight walks and cracked ribs and borrowed voice and the slow, patient consumption of everything I was for people who had gathered in their hundreds to cheer my departure. I thought about what it had cost me. I thought about what I had right now, in this moment, ordinary hands and rest, and a man beside me who had waited 6 years simply because he believed I was worth the wait. And, I said, I think I'm going to be someone I've never had the energy to meet yet. Fenric was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'd like to meet her too. I looked at him. He looked back. And for the first time in 7 years, maybe for the first time ever, I smiled without calculating what it might cost me. You cannot pour from an empty cup, but an empty cup, given time and warmth and the right kind of quiet, can fill again. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Now listen, I need something from you, and I'm going to be direct about it. The algorithm does not care about good stories. It doesn't reward craft or depth or the kind of writing that actually makes you feel something in your chest. It rewards numbers, likes, comments, shares. That is the reality of this space, and I need you to work with me. If this story moved you, if Selah's name is going to be in your head tonight, then do something about it right now while it's still sitting in your body. Hit the like button, leave a comment, even just one word, even just more, because that comment tells the platform that real people are here, that this story is worth showing to someone else who needs it. And if you know someone who is exhausted from giving everything to people who don't see them, share this with them. Not because I'm asking, because Selah's story is their story, and they deserve to hear it. The like button, a comment, a share. That's all it takes to make sure the next episode reaches someone who needs it. Selah is not done yet. Neither are we.